Welcome, everybody, to the fifth episode of Facts on the Ground podcast. My name is Jesse Zerwell. I'm pleased to have as my guest with me today, Shireen Al-Adeimi. She's an assistant professor of education at Michigan State University. She is also a prolific writer and speaker on Yemen, especially the war that's been waging there for 5 years. And she was also born in Yemen, so it's her home country, and obviously is quite important to her. But Shireen, thank you for joining us. And the first question I'd like to ask you is for those viewers who aren't familiar, because it hasn't received a lot of news coverage over the last 5 years. How did the war, I say the war on Yemen, people often say the war in Yemen, but it's become a war on Yemen. How did it begin, and what trajectory did it follow, and where do things stand now?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Jesse. And I think the roots of the conflict are a lot deeper than what we can cover possibly in this interview.
Right.
But if there's a tangible time frame, I think starting with the Arab Spring of 2011, where Tunisia began, people in Tunisia began revolting against their longtime president, and Yemen was one of the earliest countries to follow suit in January of 2011. At the time, they were revolting against the President Saleh, who had been in power from 1978 onwards and very well entrenched, as dictators are. And people began a peaceful revolution because they wanted something different. Yemen was the poorest country in the Middle East. Meanwhile, Saleh and his system were benefiting from the country's resources, privately benefiting from them. And from there on, things kind of fell apart, where it turned into armed conflict between Saleh supporters, Saleh and people who were previously his allies, who began to kind of co-opt the people's protests.
Mm-hmm.
And so his vice president, in a negotiated settlement with the various Gulf countries in the UN, ended up being the interim president for the next couple of years. Unfortunately, his 2-year term was up, and even with an extension, he wasn't really getting anything done. Hadi is the current UN-recognized president in Yemen, but he doesn't really have any legitimacy with the Yemeni people. Nobody elected him. He was part of the system that people were revolting against. And so with the rise of the Houthi movement in northern Yemen, who had long clashed with President Saleh from the 90s and early 2000s, Saudi Arabia began to see that whatever civil conflict was brewing in Yemen in late 2014 and early 2015 was going to be bad news for them. Mm-hmm. They've always intervened in Yemeni civil wars, and this represents probably the most overt Saudi intervention in Yemen in modern times. And so they began bombing Yemen, ostensibly to restore Hadi to power, but really to just maintain their grip over Yemen because of its strategic location, and to install a puppet, essentially, who will continue to serve Saudi interests in Yemen, as previous Yemeni presidents have.
Right. Okay. Very concise history there. But in the midst of all that, there's been the worst cholera outbreak in modern history. The UN has continuously called what's happening in Yemen the world's worst humanitarian crisis. So there are massive food shortages. Basically, starvation is setting in. They're genocidal conditions. I don't think anybody would dispute that. So now, not only do Yemenis have to deal with war, with possibly getting bombed by a Saudi fighter jet, but also the ravages of COVID-19. So I'm wondering if you have any information about what the state of Yemeni society has been dealing with both war and this global pandemic.
Well, it's important to note that the Saudis aren't bombing Yemen on their own. I'm sure, as you know, that they assembled this coalition of some of the most powerful countries in the world. So the US is very much part of that coalition, the UK, and countries like Canada either sell weapons to the Saudis or sell weapons and provide logistical and military support, like the case of the US and UK and France. in addition to other Arab countries like the UAE. So when these countries get together and they're bombing people who don't even have a fighter jet to respond, to the attacks, or we're relying on 90% of their food to come from imports prior to this, and now they have a blockade that's imposed upon them that only allows about 20% of aid to enter the country. It's the worst crisis in the world because of these factors, because people aren't able to resist the onslaught of this attack, this genocidal attack on them. And the Saudis and the Americans are bombing water facilities and food storage facilities, and they're blockading the ports, and so they're bombing people and they're starving them at the same time. And so currently the health facilities are barely functioning. Over the last 5 years, about 50% of hospitals and health facilities, including ones that are operated by agencies like Doctors Without Borders, for example, 5 times they've had bombings on their facilities. So about 50% of them have been bombed. The other 50% are barely holding on. There's no personnel because the health ministry can't pay people. So for the past 2.5 years, 3 years, health workers and other government workers haven't been paid. There's no medicine coming in and out of into the country, sufficient medicine coming into the country. There are no ventilators, let alone a shortage of ventilators, for example. In my last article for In These Times magazine, I interviewed Yemeni American epidemiologist Dr. Aisha Jaman, and she noted that there are currently 4 outbreaks that the Yemeni health sector is battling. So H1N1 or swine flu, cholera, which is the worst in modern history with over 2.4 million people infected, dengue fever, and diphtheria. Diphtheria hadn't been seen in Yemen for 30 years until this war. And so, they're barely able to survive and, manage these 4 outbreaks. If COVID-19, spreads in Yemen, then I think it's a complete collapse of society, because if there's a country that's completely unprepared, like 100% unprepared to deal with this, it would be Yemen.
Right. Have you heard of any cases occurring in Yemen?
So thankfully, so far, they've seemed to have been spared, but I'm not sure if that's because of lack of testing capabilities. But in a way, the blockade kind of plays a role here, blessing in disguise, I suppose. That so far, there's only been 1 confirmed case of COVID-19 in Yemen. But even if I don't think. I hope that that's true. I really am hopeful that that remains to be the case and that it's contained. But how could they possibly test people with symptoms when most people don't have access to healthcare? So 19.3 million people in Yemen out of the 30 million population don't have any access to healthcare.
So getting back to my first question, I believe it was when I mentioned that this has been going on for 5 years, but most people who watch mainstream media for their news wouldn't know it because there's hardly any coverage. I guess in print journalism, they've been a bit better, but even then, it's kind of a whitewashed breakdown of what's happening. Why do you think there's been so much resistance from these, especially the mainstream outlets, against truthfully covering this story and conveying the enormous atrocity of it to people who are getting their news?
I think we like to think that we have a free press in this country and we have a neutral press. I think one of the most shocking things for me moving from Canada to the US was how biased the news outlets were. Like, people weren't just reporting the news. They were essentially, liberal outlets and Republican, conservative outlets, which I think is a shame, because when this was Obama's war, few people wanted to report on it in mainstream sources. When it became Trump's war and he essentially inherited what Obama started, I don't see a difference between the 2 administrations with the way they've handled Yemen. Then some, liberal news media outlets began reporting on this, but still very disconnected from what the historical roots of this are. For example, when a bomb, kills enough people for it to, pique people's interest in the media, like, the daily bombings don't seem to attract much attention. But if there's a sufficiently horrific bomb attack that kills, let's say, 100 people or so, then it's usually reported on. But oftentimes it's still misrepresented as just this, Saudi war. Like they don't question the United States role, which is deeply entrenched in this. These weapons that are being dropped on children are made in the USA.
Mm-hmm.
They're dropped with the help of US, targeting assistance. The pilots are trained by the US.
Mm-hmm.
The ground forces are trained by the US. The vehicles and aircraft are maintained by the US. And so every step of the way, the US is involved. Yet a bomb gets dropped, and it's like, oh, this thing happened in Yemen. Poor children who died. And so there's not this, deep, nuanced questioning of our democratic and Republican administrations for their role in this genocide in Yemen. And I don't know. I think it's deeply shameful that the media would play a role in this.
Yeah, I agree. And of course, we should note, too, that the U.S. involvement in Yemen is illegal. We're not there legally. The Saudis, what they're doing is not legal. Across the board, it's a war, a giant war crime and crime against humanity. And there have been a few American politicians, like Ro Khanna, for example, who've tried to push through legislation to end at least U.S. support for this war. And it seems like the measures are good, but they're a little too their teeth aren't sharp enough. There are a lot of concessions in there to Israel, for example. If you actually read the whole I'm losing the word.
The bills that they're
yeah. And so it hasn't really gone anywhere. It hasn't gotten any traction from either Democrats or Republicans, and it's every now and then we hear of, here's another proposition by Ro Khanna to end the war, and then it just news about it fades into obscurity and nothing seems to get done. What's your take on that? Why is there such a clog in Congress to do anything meaningful about this?
I think this is unfortunate, but it speaks to Congress's lack of any authority. Now, the Constitution grants Congress authority over war, and yet when they did eventually pass the War Powers Resolution in 2019, it took a couple of years with coordination from Congressman Ro Khanna in the House and Senator Bernie Sanders in the Senate, and it still took a couple of years for it to push through all of these hurdles and obstacles. And yet when it finally passes in a bipartisan way in Congress, what took years to pass essentially takes seconds for Trump to veto it. Mm-hmm. Now, how could that veto even exist legally when Congress says we are reasserting our authority over war? The president isn't allowed by the Constitution to declare war on a country, and this war is illegal through and through. And we are demanding that you stop supporting this war. And he can just say, no, I'm going to veto this. I'm going to continue to be in violation of the Constitution. And it's like, okay, now what, right? And so I think it speaks to a deep failure in our governmental structure that would allow the president to continue to wage illegal wars or to violate the Constitution. Then what's the point of the Constitution if he can just veto a decision by Congress to assert the Constitution's authority? I think I still commend the efforts, because it's either do nothing about it at all or try to end this one way or the other. But there are some serious flaws.
Condemn what they've done.
Yeah.
But yeah,
it does have its shortcomings. Yeah, but I think it's because of this shouldn't be something that is even allowed to be vetoed, right? If it's trying to assert the Constitution's authority. So.
Right. And then just for clarification purposes, because again, this war on Yemen is not reported in our media very well, if at all. And so we often get this picture or this description of Houthis as terrorists or even insurgents, if you want to call them that. There's no real clear idea given to American news audiences, at least, as to who the Houthis are and what they're seeking by opposing the government?
So Houthi, first of all, is one family's last name. And the movement itself, they call themselves Ansarullah, and they emerged in the late 90s in northern Yemen as a response to Saleh's corruption. Not many dared to speak against Saleh's corruption. They did. And he responded with war. So he responds to any kind of challenge to his rule, or used to, with force, whether it was a southern secession movement or this northern kind of just outwardly speaking and preaching about him in mosques. They were a family of scholars who were speaking about him in mosques. Essentially, that's how they started. And he responded with 6 wars, and some of those wars he enlisted the help of Saudi Arabia because their province borders Saudi Arabia. And they killed their leader at the time in early 2000s, but they were not successful. He was not successful in eliminating the movement. And I think at the time, a lot of Yemenis supported their cause, at least started to identify with it because, the rest of the country was also living through his corruption, the consequences of his corruption. Since then, they've continued to play a prominent role. So in late 2014, they essentially staged a coup against this Hadi president. Whether his presidency is legitimate or not is another question, but they tried to force him essentially to do the things that he promised he would do under the agreement of his interim presidency. And when he fled, they placed him under house arrest, and when he fled, they chased him to the south, and that's when Saudi Arabia began bombing. And so a lot of people are not happy with the way the Houthis have handled this, that staging a coup wasn't the best way to contain this, and in fact it prompted the civil war. I think but of course they still also have a lot of support from Yemenis, otherwise they wouldn't have been able to maintain essentially 5 years of resistance with very little. So they do have a lot of support in Yemen. I think the bottom line is that it doesn't matter what Americans think about Houthis. It doesn't even matter what I think about them because I don't live in Yemen, right? It matters that we as Americans are holding our government accountable, and our government has no business intervening in other countries. And then I think it's up to the Yemeni people to decide if, moving forward, if after all of this ends, if Houthis are going to be the way forward for them or not, right? I don't think, obviously the Houthis have also been accused of committing crimes in Yemen over the last, there have been tens of thousands of civilians who have been killed, and I think everybody should be held accountable, but that's up to the Yemeni people to decide in whatever way they see fit. But one thing that gets reported a lot is their affiliation with Iran, and I think that's completely overblown. Iran doesn't have interests in Yemen like they did in Syria, for example. It's been 5 years and you find no remnants of Iranian influence or Iranian interference on the ground in Yemen. No Iranians killed or captured, no Iranian weapons that have been credibly tied to Yemen. The country is under full blockade. So yes, they have a positive relationship with the Houthis, but the idea that this is a proxy war or that Iran is involved in any significant way, I think is completely overblown.
Yeah, I haven't heard that. I've heard, I guess, rumblings of that, but yeah, I haven't seen any evidence of that, and that seemed kind of like a red herring that went away really quickly.
Well, actually, you still will. Every article you read about Yemen will still say Iran-backed Houthis, as though it's the same thing as U.S.-backed Saudis.
Right.
So there's this equivalency that Iran is somehow involved, and they're not.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to ask you too if there was a sectarian component to the Houthis' resistance. Are they Shia, and does that have anything to do with their resistance movement in Yemen?
Absolutely not. They are Shia. They're from a branch of Shiism called Zaydi Islam, which only really exists in Yemen. But also 40% of the population in Yemen is Zaydi, and they've had no problems coexisting with the Sunnis for thousands of years. In fact, the Zaydis ruled Yemen for 1,000 years. And when the Houthis were clashing with President Saleh himself was a Zaydi, and he was the head of state. Yes, he was secular, but the issue of sectarianism didn't come into play until Saudi made it, part of their narrative as like a bunch of Sunni states trying to counter the influence of Shia Iran in Yemen. Again, I think that's part of their propaganda. Many people have fallen for this narrative, unfortunately, but it doesn't have any, bearing on the conflict. It's not a Sunni-Shia war in Yemen.
Yeah, I find that whenever Western audiences think about, for example, the war in Yemen or in Iraq, that they automatically impose this sectarian sort of cover over it that helps them kind of explain away why this is happening. It's not that we illegally invaded and have been illegally occupying Iraq for 17 years now. It's because you have Sunni and you have Shia, and they've never gotten along with each other, and this has been going on for thousands of years, and this is just another iteration of it. And of course, it's complete bullshit, but that's pretty much the version we get in the West here. And I think again, that speaks to the horrible media coverage we continue to get here, even after 5 years, even after the whole world knows what's going on. I wanted to ask you, I read something recently about Antonio Gutierrez from the UN calling for, I believe it was him, calling for a world ceasefire in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Has that had any effect on the war in Yemen?
Yeah, so on April 9th, Saudi announced that they were imposing a 2-week unilateral ceasefire in Yemen. That's a pretty big deal when they're bombing every single day, to say that they're going to stop bombing unilaterally for 2 weeks. And then on April 15th, so that's just a week later, they started bombing again, or they resumed bombing, and they bombed several cities across Yemen. If you look at Yemen Data Project, they'll show the statistics for March, and April, including the time of the so-called ceasefires. So they say on the one hand that they're trying to look for a way out of this war, and they're trying to protect Yemen from COVID implications. The truth is that they're losing this war. The truth is that they're, spending $200 million a day by some estimations on bombing Yemen.
Mm-hmm.
And they assembled an army of massive proportions. And 5 years into this, they're still not able to do anything except for kill and starve women, children, and men. And so I think it's deeply embarrassing that the Saudis got themselves involved in this, and they arrogantly thought that this was going to be a 2-week endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
And now that they are dealing with falling oil prices, and they're dealing with, COVID-19 in Saudi Arabia, including in the, there's a New York Times report about 150 Saudi royals who have been infected with COVID. And so they're dealing with all of these issues, and they are trying to end this, I think, on their terms. They haven't been able to maintain any kind of ceasefire that they've announced, though.
What would you say their end game is? I mean, obviously having a proxy government that, answers to every beck and call, but and control over resources. But how do they think they're going? They've destroyed the country, and who do they think, if they get their way, is going to rebuild it? How do they think that the infrastructure is going to return and the sicknesses are going to be wiped out? It just seems, it puts me in mind of when Saddam declared war against Iran in 1980, and he said at first, this is going to be a whirlwind war, we're going to trounce them. And then look what happened. 8 years later, it ended basically in a stalemate with millions dead, the introduction of chemical weapons onto the battlefield again. So from your perspective, like you said, the Saudis are playing a losing game here. Why do they keep doing it? Is it they just don't know? Is it hubris, or they don't have any other strategy? What's your perspective?
I think there are a lot of assumptions here, fair assumptions, but that there was a strategy, that they were thinking about implications, and I think they were just driven by hubris. They called it decisive storm. There's nothing decisive about this, and it's not a storm. It's been 5 years. And so you have Mohammed bin Salman, who 2 months into his introduction to the world as Saudi's, deputy crown prince at the time and defense minister, now he's the crown prince and de facto ruler. 2 months into this, he begins launching this war as a resume war, so to speak. And so I don't think there was any kind of strategic planning or thinking on his behalf. And he has silenced a lot of Saudi royals who have opposed his actions in Yemen through arrests and other means. And so I think the UAE maybe has a different role to play. They are, there's this AP investigation that uncovered at least 18 secret prisons in South Yemen, which this coalition controls, and it's run by the UAE. And they take people who are suspected terrorists, quote unquote, and they torture them. There's been documented sexual and other forms of torture by the UAE. The UAE is also occupying Yemenis islands, for example, the islands of Socotra. They tried to launch an offensive on Hodeidah, the port of Hodeidah, a couple summers ago and failed. But they're trying to control Yemeni ports as well. So the UAE, I feel like, has a much more nefarious objective here, much more imperialistic objective, whereas Saudi are essentially just, bombing and hoping to win through bombing.
So as we wrap up here, I'd just like to ask you two more questions, if I can. It seems like Joe Biden is going to be the Democratic nominee. Unfortunately isn't the right word, but it doesn't even do it justice. But and it's going to be Trump. Trump and Biden, essentially two war criminal sexual assailants. Just horrendous choices that I think point to the end of American empire, at least as we've known it. So do you see hope in, I think the answer is clear with Trump, but if Biden were to get elected, given that this war started under his watch, do you think there's any hope that he make any kind of move to even reduce the atrocity of what's happening there?
I think it's really important to note that, yes, Biden, this happened under his watch and, the Obama administration. And it lasted all the way through. So from March 2016 to, March 2015 to December 2016, essentially. By then, already figures were saying that 10,000 Yemeni civilians were dead. By then, they had already been bombing funerals and homes and schools and hospitals. And the US was even more involved back then with, even providing a mid-air refueling to the Saudis. And so I don't think the guy who helped start this war is going to be enthusiastic about ending it, no matter what he says to win a campaign. He says he's going to punish the Saudis and not sell weapons to them. Well, you're still, operating on the ground. You have Green Berets at the Saudi border. You're enabling this war every step of the way. You can't just, create a fire and then turn around and say, oh, I'm not an arsonist, actually, I'm the firefighter, right? So I think it's deeply concerning and disappointing and really devastating for the Yemeni people that we're not going to get Bernie Sanders, the guy who tried to champion this through Congress, even when it wasn't a popular effort, a war to take on, a cause to take on. But we're going to get the guy who either started it or the guy who happily maintains this war because of his deep connection to the Saudis. And so I think it doesn't bode well for the Yemeni people.
Okay, so grim prognosis, but yeah, I think it's important to dissect that truth. And then, so my last question for you would be, I guess more in general, this has been going on for 5 years. It's still going on. Do you see any hope at all of it ending diplomatically anytime soon, or even within the next half decade?
Oh, he said half decade and my stomach turned.
Because I don't trust that, our next master is going to do anything to try to stop it.
Yeah, I think the effects on Yemen is going to go on for decades, given how much we've lost. There's just been an entire generation now that's been, has had their hopes and dreams completely destroyed, if not their lives entirely. And whether it's education or economic indicators or any indicator you look at, we're back 20, 30 years. And so for Yemen to rebuild, even if it were to stop right now, the rebuilding is going to take decades. But I hope that, coronavirus has shown us that you can be as arrogant as you want, and then something like a virus takes hold and our entire economy is suffering and things are shut down and unemployment rates are rising. In times like these, I hope people will start to really consider that maybe we shouldn't be bombing other people. Maybe we should just take care of our own affairs. Of course, poverty and healthcare systems have always been deeply problematic in this country, but it takes something so drastic for people to see that actually our system is really broken. And instead of spending all this time and effort and money on wars, let's focus on our people, let's focus on our country, let's be more compassionate. I'm hoping that that would lead to a reduction or a ceasefire, or a ending these international adventures that the US likes to get involved in to maintain its hegemony. Beyond that, I don't see Saudi ending it unless they feel like they've won somehow. Even if they stop bombing, until they lift the blockade, people are going to continue dying in Yemen.
Well, I share your hope, absolutely, and I really do hope, as weak as that word can sound sometimes, that this genocidal war comes to an end as soon as possible. Shireen, thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. My guest today has been Shireen Al-Adeimi. She's an assistant professor of education at Michigan State University. She is a frequent and I would say excellent commentator on Yemen and the war that's been going on there for 5 years. Her latest piece is up now in these times. We'll link to that in the YouTube description, and people can find you on Twitter at Shireen818, correct?
Yes, and I focus my Twitter activities on shedding light on the war in Yemen and encouraging people to engage and help stop this war. And thank you so much for having me and for shedding light on this issue.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Talk to you soon. Stay well.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Shireen.